This is the story of a teenage girl, an honors student, whose life ended in a matter of seconds. A single gunshot in the middle of the night inside an apartment.
Hi, so the body is upstairs.
Foolish, reckless handling of firearms, as if they were toys. That's not a script. That's a prosecutor, standing in a Wood County courtroom, describing how a 15-year-old girl ended up dead on a bedroom floor. Picture a Smith & Wesson 10mm handgun, half disassembled on a bed, next to a phone still open to a group chat with friends who thought they were just hanging out on a Friday night. That's the image this case leaves behind. Not a crime scene, but a sleepover that turned into a funeral. Before we go deeper into what the records actually show, make sure you're subscribed to the Crime Infinity, because we don't just cover the story, we follow the evidence. Her name was Symini Rai Moore.
On a cold night in Ohio in January of this year, I want you to meet the girl who lost her life, Symini Moore. She was 15 years old. She was a high school sophomore, and she and her friends were over at the apartment of an 18-year-old man. It's just before 11 p.m.
15 years old, a sophomore at Woodmore High School. Her family remembers a smile that lit up a room instantly, the kind that made people feel seen and cared for without her ever having to say a word. She worked at her family's restaurant. She wanted to become an OB nurse. She was counting down the days until she could get her driver's permit. On January 23rd, she never got that far. Late that night, Lake Township Police and EMS were dispatched to an apartment in Northwood, Ohio. 4 people were inside when a gun went off. Symini, an 18-year-old named Jakob Heintzelman, his girlfriend, and another male. When officers arrived, they found Symini already suffering a gunshot wound. She was pronounced dead at the scene.
So there's a lot to take in during the first couple of minutes of this body cam. Police enter a bedroom. You can see it is decked out with some interesting flag choices. Also has several flags and signs related to the Second Amendment. And they also find 18-year-old Jakob Heintzelman, and he's doing CPR on Symini Moore. It appears on the floor.
Heintzelman's explanation was simple. He told investigators he was cleaning his gun when it discharged. One sentence, one story. And for a moment, that's all the public record gave us. A tragic accident, a careless mistake, a young man who would carry that guilt for the rest of his life. But here's the question that should stop you cold. If this really was just an accident, why did the case keep growing after the gunshots stopped echoing? Heintzelman was arrested and charged with reckless homicide, held without bond, and then arraigned with bond set at $75,000 and electronic monitoring if released. Investigators didn't stop at the shooting itself. As they built the case, they found something else. Evidence that Heintzelman had been driving around earlier that same day with the handgun in his car, fully loaded and accessible. Not stored, not secured, just sitting there, ready to fire, in a vehicle on public roads. Prosecutors would later say investigators uncovered additional evidence of reckless firearm handling beyond that one detail. A pattern, not an isolated slip.
Well, yeah, I mean, I said you've been in the Marine Corps, so, you should know first thing about firearm safety and handling.
You would think I would know damn near everything about it, but they still surprise.
Did you see this?
It happens.
Foolish, reckless handling of firearms as if they were toys. That's the first time we hear it. It won't be the last. Then the case took a turn nobody outside that courtroom expected. A grand jury indicted Heintzelman, and he waived his preliminary hearing, sending the matter straight to trial. But buried inside the same court proceedings was a second track entirely. A probation violation tied to a prior firearm possession issue, while Heintzelman was already under a no-contact order. The judge handed down consecutive jail terms on that violation, refusing to run them concurrently, stating on the record that doing so would demean the serious nature of what he'd already done. This was not a first brush with guns. This was a young man who had already been told, by a judge to stay away from firearms, and did not.
Really found this next part shocking. He says that those who witnessed Moore's death made jokes after she was shot.
Her best friend made a joke and she was like, I really don't know how to react. I'm just going to use humor and say why. She was like, well, that's she.
And then came the discovery that turned a fatal accident into something far darker. During the investigation into Symini's death, detectives searched Heintzelman's cell phone. What they found had nothing to do with the shooting. Prosecutors confirmed he would ultimately plead guilty to 2 separate counts of illegal use of a minor in nudity-oriented material tied to 2 different victims, both confirmed by prosecutors to be separate from Symini and from each other. Sit with that for a second. A phone that was seized to explain how a gun went off ended up exposing a pattern of exploitation that had nothing to do with the case investigators thought they were building. The homicide charge was the door. What was behind it was something else entirely.
Before the video you just watched, he also gets a phone call in the interview room as he was waiting for a detective, and he talks about ordering food.
Foolish, reckless handling of firearms, as if they were toys. Say it again, because by the time this case reached its conclusion, that phrase had stopped describing a single moment on January 23rd. It had become a description of a life. In May, Heintzelman pleaded guilty, not to murder, but to reckless homicide with a gun specification, improper transportation of a firearm in a motor vehicle, carrying a concealed weapon, an underage alcohol violation, and the 2 counts tied to what was found on his phone. Judge Molly Mack, following a joint recommendation from prosecutors and the defense, sentenced him to 7.5 years for the homicide-related charges, plus 4 years on each of the illegal use of a minor counts, those 2 terms running concurrently with each other, but consecutively to the homicide sentence. Total, 11.5 years in an Ohio prison.
Involving the bullet that went off as he says he was cleaning his gun. Heintzelman was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison on the reckless homicide charges and also 4 years in prison on the case related to the material found on his phone. So in total, he is sentenced to 11.5 years in Ohio prison. Heintzelman will also be a Tier 2 sex offender, and he will have to register.
He was also classified as a Tier 2 sex offender, required to register with the sheriff's office every 6 months for 25 years after his release. The prosecutor's office called it what it was, a senseless, completely avoidable event. Not an act of malice in the eyes of the law. Reckless homicide is a lesser charge than murder, built around indifference rather than intent. But indifference killed a 15-year-old just as permanently as intent would have. The law drew a legal distinction. The outcome didn't care about the distinction at all.
Heintzelman just had a gun that went off and hit a young girl, yet he seems pretty unfazed by what just happened, as he even calmly delivers the news that Symini Moore is likely dead.
Foolish, reckless handling of firearms, as if they were toys, 3 times now. Because that's the phrase a judge and a prosecutor kept returning to, and it's the one that should stay with you longer than any interrogation footage could. Not because it's dramatic, because it's precise. This case wasn't built on a single bad second. It was built on a string of them. A loaded gun left accessible in a car, a documented history of firearm violations while under court order, and a phone full of evidence that had nothing to do with cleaning a weapon at all. Symini Moore went to a friend's apartment on a Friday night. She never got to finish high school, never got her driver's permit, never became the nurse she wanted to be. Her family started a fundraiser that raised over $20,000 in 2 days, not for revenge, but just to bury her. 11.5 years is the number the court settled on. Whether that number matches the scope of what was uncovered, a reckless death, a documented pattern of firearm violations, and separate exploitation charges involving other minors, is not something we're going to tell you how to feel about. That's the question this case actually leaves open. If you want to look at this yourself, the sentencing details and the full list of charges are part of the public record through the Wood County Common Pleas Court and the Wood County Prosecutor's Office. Pull the docket. Read what the judge actually said at sentencing.
Then tell us in the comments, does reckless homicide as a legal category still make sense when the same defendant is found with a loaded, unsecured firearm on multiple separate occasions? That's the case. If you want more investigations built entirely on the public record, like this video, share it, subscribe, and turn on notifications for the Crime Infinity, because we'll be back with the next one.